Hi everyone, are you ready to get started? I'm really excited to see so many people interested in learning about SQL and ODBC. So this session is Introduction to SQL and ODBC for FileMaker developers. I'm Greg Lane from Skeleton Key. Just a tiny bit about me. I lead a team of 9 certified developers at Skeleton Key. We're an FBA Platinum level partner. We build custom solutions using the FileMaker Platform. I'd like to learn a little more about you. How many of you are here for your very first DevCon? Wow, that's awesome. I hope you're having a great week. So let me dive in. I've got a lot to cover today. I may not get through all of my slides. The slides are out on the website already. And I actually left some things in the slides on the website that are not in my presentation just to cut it down a little bit. I will try really hard to save a little time for questions at the end. And I'm glad to stick around afterwards if you've got more questions. So our agenda for today is to talk about just a few basic terms and concepts. We'll look at the basic configuration stuff for both Windows, Mac, and using FileMaker Cloud with ODBC as well. And I've got lots of demos for using ODBC and SQL throughout the FileMaker platform. As much as we can at the end, I'll talk about just general SQL commands, writing SQL statements. And I've got lots of examples to show. I've got a lot more in a sample file that's already out there on the website you can download. It's got almost 100 different SQL examples in it that you can tear apart, learn from, and use. So let's dive in. I should say what we're not covering today. So there's some features in the platform, such as using FileMaker Server as a JDBC data source. That certainly works, but I'm not going to show any demos of that today. Also using FileMaker Pro as an ODBC or JDBC data source. I'm not planning to show any of that today either. And no data definition commands. We're not going to be altering the schema of our databases. That's certainly possible using plugins or using ODBC. You can modify your tables and fields and all of that, but we're not going to cover any of that today. So let's dive into a demo. A lot of this is going to be demos. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the slides. I'll be jumping back and forth quite a bit. And there's a lot in these demos that can go wrong, so hopefully that won't happen. So first thing we want to do, and actually I skipped a slide there, my bad. So SQL, structured query language. This was a standard developed by IBM back in the 70s. It's been used in databases for a long time. If you're coming from other database platforms, you're probably already very familiar with SQL, and you're wondering why FileMaker doesn't use it more. But for those of you who have come to databases starting with FileMaker, it may be a little bit foreign to you, and I'm hoping to kind of demystify it a little bit today and help you move forward with that, because there's a lot of powerful things you can do with it. ODBC stands for Open Database Connectivity. That's a standard that was created by Microsoft in the 80s as a way to make it easier for application software to connect to databases. So you didn't have to write in support for every single database out there. You could include ODBC support in your application, and the databases could include ODBC support, and it acts as a bridge between the two pieces of software so that they can talk to each other. The ODBC driver and the ODBC driver manager work together to allow you to connect to a particular database. The DSN, and we're going to go through examples of all of this. So the DSN is the data source name. This is just the configuration that you're going to set up to allow your application to talk to the server. And ESS is a FileMaker unique feature that allows the FileMaker platform to work with ODBC data sources in a very native FileMaker way without writing any SQL statements. So it hooks right into your relationship graph. You get these kind of virtual tables that show up, and you can create relationships to them. You can have layouts based on those tables, all of that. We'll look at a quick example of that as well. So the basic configuration for ODBC and Windows, let's just dive into a quick example of that. So here I am in a Windows environment running on my local machine as a virtual machine. First thing you want to know is that if you're connecting to, for instance, a FileMaker ODBC data source like FileMaker Server, you can install the FileMaker ODBC driver, which you drill in after you've unzipped your installer package. When you're installing either FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Server, there's an extras folder in here. Down there, there's an XDBC folder. This is where you'll find the JDBC driver and the ODBC client driver installer. Inside there, you're going to find both 32-bit and 64-bit versions. Make sure you install the version that matches your client software that you're using with ODBC. You want to make sure that your client software, the driver, and the DSN that you create all have a matching architecture, 32-bit or 64-bit. So I've already installed that driver, so we're going to go ahead and create a DSN. The easiest way to do this is hit your Windows key and just type ODBC. You'll see options here. This is a lot easier than it used to be on older versions of Windows, where you had to dig into the Windows folder and find the right version, that sort of thing. 64-bit or 32-bit. We're going to use the 64-bit version. This is the driver manager. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. First thing you want to look at is make sure your driver is installed under the Drivers tab. The FileMaker ODBC driver is right here. And keep in mind that the FileMaker ODBC driver is only used when you're connecting to FileMaker as the data source. So if you're connecting to FileMaker Server, for instance, from an ODBC client, whether that's FileMaker Pro, or if it is Microsoft Excel, or a charting package, or whatever it might be, that's where you use the FileMaker ODBC driver. You don't use this driver if you're connecting to MySQL or Oracle or SQL Server. You need a specific driver for the database that you're connecting to. So I have other drivers installed here, but I'm just going to create a quick DSN based on this FileMaker driver. You have basically two choices. You can create user DSNs or system DSNs. The user DSN is only going to work for the currently logged in user. So in most cases, you'll want to set up a system DSN, especially if you're doing this on your FileMaker server for the FileMaker server application to use that DSN. So you click the Add button. It's going to give you a choice of your drivers that are installed. I'm going to choose the FileMaker ODBC driver, and then we get kind of this wizard interface that's going to step us through the process of creating the DSN. We'll name the DSN and just step through here. I have a test FileMaker Cloud instance that I'm going to use for this particular DSN, and we'll just hit Next. Whoops, I skipped a step there. It must be cut off on here. Hold on, I got ahead of myself. So here's an option that allows you to connect to the host to see what databases are available. So we'll click the Next button, and then it should go out to that server and show us a list of those. Come on. Oh, I told you things could go wrong. And they have. All right, so I'm going to skip this and do exactly the same thing in the Windows environment, or I'm sorry, in the Mac environment. And I've run through that 10 times in the last couple of days, and it's always worked. So my apologies. So moving on to the Mac, a couple of things you need to know about the Mac is that there's not a driver manager installed by default on a Mac anymore. There used to be in older versions of OS X. Currently, there's not. So I recommend using this ODBC manager just go to odbcmanager.net. It's free. It's actually provided by Actual Technologies, which is the company that wrote the FileMaker ODBC driver and the other drivers that are available for the Mac platform for using ESS. So you install that driver manager, you install the driver, it's available on your installation image for Pro or Server, and then you create the DSN. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is our ODBC manager. It looks very familiar. You've got your list of drivers that are installed on your Mac, and you can, again, create a user DSN or a system DSN. I'm going to add a DSN here, again, using FileMaker ODBC. Wondering if I've lost internet connectivity here. And the answer is yes. with me just a moment. We'll get this going again. There we go. I think we're good. I may have to force quit this to get it back, but that will be all right. Here we go. All right, so I'm seeing my database now that's hosted out there in my FileMaker Cloud instance. If I had multiple databases, they would all be listed here. I can choose the one that I want this DSN to use. There's some other options here, language-specific options that you can set. You can also log queries, that sort of thing, through the driver. So when you get to this final screen, you'll have a chance to see the details of what it's going to create for this DSN. You can click the test button. It's going to prompt you for your credentials. And then it will reach out and do a test. And we can see here that the connection was successful. We connected to FileMaker Cloud Server 1.15.2. It's encrypted, and the test was successful. So that's great. I'm going to do one more DSN here to a MySQL data source. And actually, I did not want to use that driver. I wanted to use the actual technologies driver. So very similar process. We step through this. I'm going to call this one MySQL test. It's a MySQL data source. We'll continue. It's on localhost because I've got MySQL running on my local machine here. Then we can connect to that server. Continue. We'll choose our database here. There are different databases installed in MySQL. I want to use my demo database for this. And we've got other options, again, for logging queries, that sort of thing. I'll continue, and then I can run a test here to make sure that that is working as well. And yes, we got a successful message there. Okay, so let me move on to the next step here then, which is the basic configuration of FileMaker Cloud. So this is new, since last October, November, somewhere in there when FileMaker Cloud launched. But you can set up ODBC connections to MySQL, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server through FileMaker Cloud. So let's take a quick look at how you do that. When you log into your FileMaker Cloud admin console, you just go to the configuration page. And down at the bottom here are ODBC sources. You can add a new ODBC source. Let me just show you the configuration of this one that I've already set up. Basically, you have the option to choose the driver for MySQL, Oracle, or SQL Server. You name your DSN up here. Set the name of the database that you want to connect to, the server IP address or host name, the port you're connecting to. You can test it down here by entering your credentials and just hit Test Source Connection. All right. So really easy, and you can use that then for connecting to get access to the data in your databases that are hosted there with FileMaker Cloud. It will work for ESS. It will also work for server-side scripts that you call with perform script on server. All right, so let's take a quick look at ESS. ESS allows you to use an ODBC data source as if it were a FileMaker table. You don't have to write any SQL statements. It's really pretty straightforward. Once you get it set up, it will be awesome. You'll love it. So let me cancel that. I'm just going to create a new solution, just starting from scratch here. I'll call that ESS and put it on my desktop. We don't need to define any tables or fields yet. The first thing we want to do is go to Manage External Data Sources. Create a new external data source. We'll call this contacts, or actually let's call this MySQL. We'll say it's an ODBC data source. We'll specify the DSN and choose this MySQL DSN that we created a few moments ago. And we can specify a username and password here. You can prompt the user every time they want to connect, but you can also put a username and password in here that will be used by all users. You can also, if you're using a SQL Server data source, you can tie this in with single sign-on. So that's an option as well. Let me just go ahead and put my credentials in here for everyone to see, super secret. And you can filter the tables that appear. So if you've got a really big database that you're connecting to with lots of tables, you can put some filters in here so that you're not going to be bothered by some of those tables that you don't need to use. We're just going to show everything. I'll click OK there. Now we go to our relationship graph. We add a new table occurrence. Under data sources, we're going to choose our external data source, MySQL, and that allows us to see the tables that are in that MySQL data source. We can add that. Notice that the name of that table occurrence is it's italicized. If we hover over the arrow up here, it shows us the data source is coming from MySQL, and that it's an ODBC data source. If we switch over to the Tables tab, we're going to see that that contacts table is also an italicized. The source is coming from MySQL. We can double-click on that to see the fields that are in that contacts table, and these are referred to as shadow fields and shadow tables. All of these validation settings are coming in automatically based on the field types that are in MySQL. So if we double-click on that, we'll see that it sets a maximum number of characters to correspond to the data type of the fields that are in the SQL database. You can add additional constraints here, additional validation options. So it's not empty or a certain data type, that sort of thing, or validated by calculation. All of that works just fine with these shadow fields. You also have the option to create additional fields in here that are either calculation or summary fields based on these fields. You can't add text or number. Nothing you do here is going to alter the schema of the ODBC database. This is only things that are calculated on the fly within FileMaker. All right, so now that we've created that, we should have a new layout called contacts. And sure enough, here's my ODBC data that's flowing right into FileMaker. This data doesn't exist in this FileMaker file. It's only coming from MySQL. So let me just switch to table view, and I can do a find for everyone named Greg. And I get all those records. There's 5,000 records showing up in here. So really simple to do that. I can create a new record. When I commit that record, that's when it gets an ID assigned to it. That ID is coming from MySQL. So it's getting populated in MySQL, and then it's showing up in FileMaker as soon as the record is committed. We can also delete that record. And it is gone. So you can create relationships with these table occurrences. There's a lot you can do. You can build layouts based on these or link to these. There's a lot you can do. So what is FileMaker kind of doing under the hood for us? There's a lot going on, actually. So FileMaker is writing all these SQL statements. This is just a log of what's going on the MySQL side. So when we connected, it was somewhere about here in the log. First thing it does is it gets a count of the records in the contacts table. Then when we go to a layout based on that table occurrence, it's going to select the ID values from the contacts table. And then for the first 25 of those records, it's going to get all the fields that appear on the current layout. And then as you scroll through those records or you do finds and other things like that, it's sending additional select statements to the server to get that data that it needs to display on the layout. When we did our find, which was right here, I know that's a little hard to read, but basically it did a select ID from contacts where first name is like Greg with these % signs around it, which makes it a case-insensitive wildcard search. So it behaves very much like a FileMaker search would, and that's why it's doing that. So it gets the ID values that match that, and then it does another select. So those ID values would be out here in this list. And that's what you're seeing that's returned in the find for that record. Later on, we deleted a record. Actually, before that, we inserted a record right here, created a new record with the first name and last name fields, and I set those to John Smith. Those got inserted. Here's where it got the ID of that record that just got created. And then further down, here's where I deleted a couple of records. Delete from contacts where ID equals that specific ID number. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes here, but it's not magic. there's just a lot of SQL that's being written automatically by FileMaker to give you a very natural FileMaker-like experience with these ESS tables. This log, it's defined with your DSN setup. So where you set up the DSN, you can define where this log goes. And in my case, it is, I put it in my users folder in the shared folder, my SQL query log. But you can define that location when you set up the DSN. It's a great, digging through that log is a great way to understand how FileMaker is working. If you've got certain finds that are really slow or something like that, you can dig into those queries and talk to your SQL DBA and ask them what you can do to improve performance with that, perhaps. Okay, let's go back to the keynote. So a couple of things about using ESS. It's really easy to configure. You've got this live two-way connection, so everything you change in FileMaker gets pushed back to the SQL data source, and it's live all the time. Requires no SQL knowledge. The driver and the DSN only have to be set up on the host machine. So if you're using FileMaker Server, FileMaker Cloud to host your database, you just set the DSN up there, and then all of your users, including FileMaker Go, will be able to use those data sources. For FileMaker Cloud, it only works with MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and Oracle. It also works with FileMaker Server. It will work with Postgres and DB2 data sources. You do have to purchase those drivers separately through Actual Technologies. And the same is true if you're using a Mac host. You have to purchase the drivers from Actual Technologies to be able to use ESS data sources on a Mac host. All right, the next thing I want to look at is importing from an ODBC data source. So from here on out, we're going to have to write a little bit of SQL. I'm keeping the examples really simple so everybody can follow along. I'm just going to use a simple contacts table for most of our queries. It should be real clear what's going on. So let me dive into an example just using FileMaker Pro. I'm just going to come up here and go to Open, Browse, and in this Open dialog, I can choose to show ODBC data sources. So I'm going to choose ODBC data source. I'm going to choose my MySQL data source again. Enter the credentials for that. This is FileMaker's query builder, SQL query builder, that we can use to kind of graphically build a query. So if I want to grab the city and the company and the email address from that contacts table, I can just click through this and build my SQL query. I can do a where clause, and a where clause is basically a find. It limits the records that you're going to get back to a certain criteria. Say I only want the records where the state equals Missouri or something like that, I can do that. I can also do an order by clause, which is a sort, so that the records that come back to us are in a sorted order, and it'll let you choose from the fields that you've added that are in your field list. You can also edit this query directly, so I'm going to come in here and just put in an asterisk, which means to return all of the fields from that ODBC data source. When I execute this query, FileMaker is going to create a brand new file, and I'll just use that default name. And now it has imported all of that ODBC data from MySQL into a FileMaker file, created a table for me, created these fields that correspond to the ODBC fields. But all of that data is in here. This is not a link to that data. It's a one-time import of that data, just like you'd imported a CSV file. So if we modify this data, it's not going to affect the server or the MySQL data in any way. You can do the same thing. So I did this by creating a brand new file, but most likely you've already got a file that you want to import your data into. So you can create a script to do an import. So the import records script step allows us to choose ODBC as a data source. So we can choose our MySQL test data source, put in our credentials, and store those credentials as part of this script step. And then we can either manually write our SQL here, or we can use the query builder again. You can also use calculated SQL text as part of your import if you want to use variables or field values as part of your query. You can do that. I'm going to do a simple select star from contacts where state equals Missouri. And then I'm going to specify the import order, going into the current table, and I'm going to do update matching records in the found set, add remaining records as new. I'll click OK here. Whoops, I have to specify a match field. Got that. Now I can save that. Let me include that in the scripts menu. I'll get that out of the way. Now, if I find the records that are currently in Missouri, and I change this first record and delete that name, and then I delete a bunch of other records, so now we've only got 43 records from Missouri. But if I run that script, it's going to go out and import those same records from Missouri, and it's going to update the records in the current found set. So notice this first record got its value back in the first name field, and I got the missing records repopulated as well. All right, so this will work with any ODBC data source. So whether you're using some obscure ODBC driver or whatever it is, as long as you've got a driver for the machine where this is running, it will work. It's not limited to the same drivers as the ESS process. Very flexible. You can create your own SQL statements any way you want to. This does work with perform script on server and scheduled scripts. You just have to make sure the DSN is set up properly, but it works great. If you're running this on local workstations, it does have to have the driver and the DSN installed on each workstation. It won't use the server's DSN and driver that has been configured unless you're using perform script on server. And using perform script on server would be the only way to get this to work with FileMaker Go. All right, so next let's look at the execute SQL script step. There's also a function with a very similar name. So notice the space here in execute SQL. There's a function called execute SQL that has no space in the name. It's a function versus a script step. They do very different things actually. But I'll show examples of both of those and why you'd want to use them. But basically this allows you to insert, update, or delete records or define schema in an ODBC data source. So let's dive into an example here. I'm going to close this file that I had just created, this converted file, and switch to another file called contacts that I have hosted on FileMaker Cloud, and that got closed a little bit ago, so I'm going to log into it again. So in this file, I have a couple of scripts already created that I want to look at just to save a little time. Let me delete this last record. Actually, I'll leave it there because that's exactly the record that I wanted to use. Let's look at my scripts though. The first one here is an execute SQL script step that's going to insert a record into MySQL. So first let's look in MySQL and make sure that this record doesn't already exist there. So I'm going to open up MySQL Workbench. I'll connect to my local MySQL server. I'll select from contacts where ID equals 5001. I'll run that query, and the record is not there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to FileMaker. Let's look at this query and what it's doing. So we're connecting to this MySQL test DSN as our data source. We've got this calculated SQL statement that's basically insert into the contacts table in this list of fields, ID, first name, last name, et cetera, this set of values. And the values are coming from the fields in the current record when I run this script. So we've basically concatenated in the values that we're going to insert into that table. So let me back out of here and we'll actually run this script. And hopefully, if I come back over here to MySQL Workbench, run this script again, sure enough, we got our new record that was inserted into MySQL with the values that were on the current record when we ran that. So the next script here is doing a similar thing, execute SQL again. This time we're going to update the record in the contacts table that has that ID. Now this time I've just hard-coded the value that I want to set. So I'm not using a value from a field. I'm just updating the context table and setting the company field to skeleton key, the string skeleton key, where the ID equals 50,001. So let's run that script. And we'll go back over here to MySQL Workbench, run this query again, and sure enough, the company name has been updated. All right, one more example here. That would be to delete that record from MySQL. And that query is really simple. We're going to delete from the contacts table where ID equals 50,001. So when we run that query, the record is still in this FileMaker database, because remember, this is just a FileMaker table. This is not linked to the SQL data source in this case. But if I go back over to MySQL, run this, that record is gone. So that shows you how you can create, update, and delete records in an ODBC data source from FileMaker scripts in a pretty easy way. Let me get back to Keynote, a couple of other comments about that. Again, it works with any ODBC data source, works with perform script on server, scheduled scripts. Again, you've got to have the driver and DSN on each workstation. No data comes back to your script. So when you run this, basically you get a status value that says whether or not it was successful. You're not going to get any data back. You can't send a select statement through this and get any data back. And it doesn't work with FileMaker Go except through perform script on server. So the execute SQL function, notice there's no space in here. The basics of this function, basically the first parameter is a SQL query. This is only going to work with select statements. So you can write a select statement, put it in here as the first parameter. The second parameter is a field separator that's going to appear between each of your columns or fields in the result, and then a row separator. And then you've got these optional arguments that can be used as part of your SQL statement, and we'll look at some examples of that in a bit. I would say that this is, you'll find lots of examples of this in various sessions this week, I'm sure. It's used for virtual lists a lot, for reporting, charting, all kinds of things. But overall, I would say that this is a technique to use because it's convenient to do so. It can make some things really elegant and easy, but it's not about performance. There's nothing about using the execute SQL function that is going to make your solution perform faster than a comparable native functionality in FileMaker would. So let's look at just a quick example of this. I'm going to open up the data viewer in FileMaker Pro Advanced 16. I've already got an example in here. We're going to, let me blow that up a little bit if I can. So just very simply, execute SQL, select star from contacts, and basically the result there is all of the records in the contacts table. I can extend that then to say where ID is less than 5, and because we're automatically evaluating that, we quickly see just the first 4 records from that. Something new in FileMaker 16 is that you do see error messages, whereas you used to always just get a question mark if there was a problem with your query. For instance, if I put a single quote there, it's going to tell me there's an error in the syntax of my query. And that's somewhat helpful. If I put a quote around the end of that, I've still got an error because now I've got a data type mismatch, and FileMaker is telling me helpfully that I've got incompatible data types. So my ID field is a number field, but I've given it a string to compare to, and it won't do that. So basically your data types have to match. Now you could put a function around that, the numVal function, I believe, in SQL, and then it will work again. So there's a lot you can do with this function. Anywhere you can put a calculation, you can use the execute SQL function. Just be aware of the performance implications of that. But the data viewer is the best place to try those calculations out and get them working. All right. I'm going to go through a lot more examples of using the execute SQL function when we talk about some more SQL stuff in a bit. But let me move on to a couple of other things before that. I guess a couple of details about the execute SQL function. There's no DSN required. This has nothing to do with ODBC, so you don't have to set up a DSN for this at all. This is just an internal FileMaker function where you can use a SQL select statement to get data from your FileMaker tables. It's not context dependent, so you can create ad hoc joins. You can use inner join and several types of joins within your SQL statements. It's not dependent on the relationship graph in any way. You can use data from any calculations. It works great in FileMaker Go. Does not support insert, update, or delete at all. Can be a little slow. So there are plugins, FileMaker plugins, that have features that do pretty much the same thing as the execute SQL function, but it gives more functionality as well because they can do insert, update, and delete. So you can modify your FileMaker data using a SQL statement using one of these FileMaker plugins. Has all the advantages of execute SQL function with those additional features as well, and probably some better error reporting in there as well. It does require a plugin, and therefore it doesn't work with FileMaker Go. And it has kind of the same performance limitations as the execute SQL function. Some of those plugins that I know of, and I know there are others out there, but these are the ones that I found that specifically say they work with version 16. So ScriptMaster Advanced, CNS Query, SQL Runner, the Base Elements plugin, and the MBS Monkey Bread FileMaker plugin are all options if you're interested in those. This is just an example of what the select statement looks like. If you're new to SQL, this is kind of the bird's eye view of all of the options within a select statement. So you have your column expressions in the beginning of that. You tell it where what table the data is coming from, and then you've got these optional clauses that can be out there to say where, which is your find, group by, which is kind of like doing a sub-summary. It groups your records and gives you subsets or sub-summaries of those. Having is like a where clause that applies to your groups. Union allows you to combine select statements together. Order by is your sort. And for update is really not used with execute SQL. You can use that with ODBC if you're connecting that way. So a couple of examples of select statements down here. Just selecting all the fields from the inventory table, selecting these fields from the contact table where the first name equals John, and you're ordering those by the last name field. So just some simple examples there. So let's talk briefly about using FileMaker Server or FileMaker Cloud as an ODBC data source. So if you have non-FileMaker developers that want to get access to your FileMaker developer or to your FileMaker database, you've got options with the XML API, the new data API, the REST-based API. You've also got the ODBC API, which has been around for a long time, and it's an option for other programming languages to connect to your database. You can use it for desktop applications like Excel or charting tools, things like that. So let's look at a quick example of how that works. So we set up the DSN earlier. I'm going to switch over to Excel and create a new workbook. We're going to go to the data menu and get external data from a database. I'm going to connect to the contacts DSN that I set up earlier, which is pointed to my FileMaker Cloud database using the FileMaker ODBC driver. Enter the credentials, and now it's going to show me the tables that are available in that database. And it's interesting to note that the contacts table is the main FileMaker table in there. This Maria contacts table is actually an ESS table that I set up earlier. That shows up there as well, so you can pull data out of that as well. But basically, it's going to give you a simple select statement here. You can add additional clauses to this if you want to. We'll return the data into, let's say, a pivot table. So I'll click OK. It'll take just a moment while it pulls down these records into Excel, and then I can take the values that I have here and start building my pivot table. I'll put something like last name here, so we get count of last name, and we've got our states and a count of the contacts that are in each of those states right here in my pivot table, and you can explore that using all the Excel features that you might be familiar with. All right, so again, this is a familiar interface for non-FileMaker developers that need to get access to your data. It works with local and remote connections to your server. It works with FileMaker Cloud. There's a limit of 50 connections at a time. That's the tested limit. It's really unrestricted. It's not going to be as fast or as feature-rich as other SQL backends, so don't expect to replace your high-volume websites back-end database with FileMaker necessarily, unless you're doing a lot of caching and stuff. But it is a nice option for integrating with other systems. The drivers are only available for Mac and Windows clients. So if your website is, for instance, is on a Linux server, there's not an ODBC driver to connect to FileMaker Server or FileMaker Cloud from those machines. So you have to use a Mac or a Windows machine there. So this is kind of the prototype for the insert statement. I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time because I've got other examples, but feel free to look through these slides. There are examples here of the insert statement, the update statement, delete statement. I want to say a few things about quoting and escaping when you're writing SQL statements. You always, your text literals in a SQL statement are always enclosed in single quotes. If you need to have a single quote inside of that text literal, you put two of them basically, two single quotes right together. Empty values for date, time, and number values. You can use the keyword null in your SQL statement for comparisons or to add a value. You can use that. Field and table names must be enclosed in double quotes in your SQL statements. You'll see that most of the queries that I was showing earlier, I didn't put quotes around the field names or the table names because they did not fall under these rules here. But in reality, in most cases with your systems, you're going to have things that are going to need to be quoted, and that can be a little painful. There's some custom functions out there and things to make that a little simpler for you to do it kind of dynamically on the fly. But if you're writing your, kind of hard coding your SQL statements, you want to make sure that you quote those fields and table names wherever any of these rules apply. So basically, if it's a reserved words, in the SQL reference from FileMaker, there's a list at the back of that document that has a couple of pages full of reserved words. So like the word first is a reserved word, must be quoted. You can't use it in a SQL statement. If you have spaces in your field or table name, you want to quote that to make sure that that works. If the first character is not an alphabetic character, if it's the number 1 or if it's an underscore, it's got to be quoted. If any character is not alphanumeric or an underscore, like if you've got a dash or hyphen in there, you have to make sure that that's quoted as well. That's something that trips people up a lot because you'll be writing lots of statements, they'll work, and then you'll put a different field in there, and it hits one of these rules because it's a reserved word or whatever, and suddenly your query breaks and it doesn't make sense why. It's probably because you need quotes around that. When it comes to SQL constants, like I said, text values, use single quotes around them. Number values, you just put the number value. You can use decimals. That works fine. You don't put any quotes around the number values. For dates, you want to use the date keyword followed by a space, a single quote, and then the date in this format, year-month-day. There's an alternate syntax you can use with these curly brackets. If you're using ODBC, these don't work with the execute SQL function inside of FileMaker, but they do work with ODBC connections. Time works similarly. You want to use a 24-hour time. And there, timestamps combine the date and the time together, and a logical or Boolean value is just a 0, 1. There are lots of SQL operators when you're writing SQL statements. You can do basic math with numbers. You can do character concatenation. The double pipe symbols, so 2 pipe characters, are essentially equivalent to an ampersand when you're doing a FileMaker calculation. The plus and the minus characters, operators, have kind of special behavior in SQL, and it has to do with what happens to the trailing spaces in the fields that or the values that you're concatenating together, whether those spaces get eliminated or whether they all get pushed to the end of the concatenated value. So there's some historical reasons why it works that way, but for the most part, use the double pipe to do concatenation. Date values can do some math as well. You can add a number of days to a date. You can subtract 2 dates from each other and get the number of days between those dates, much like you would do in FileMaker. The relational operators, we're all pretty familiar with the equality and inequality operators. SQL also has like, in, and between operators. That are kind of special case things that you can use. I've got some examples in the file I'll show you in just a bit that uses some of those as well. Logical operators are and, or, and not are the primary logical operators that are available to you when you're writing SQL statements. Most of the SQL support in FileMaker is based on the SQL 92 standard, so it's a pretty old standard. There are some updates in there, especially in version 15, I think, where you have some options to get a limited number of records, things like that. But for the most part, the flavor of SQL that we're using here is pretty basic and standard, so some of the things that you might be used to in other environments may not work in FileMaker. There are lots of functions, though, that do work, and I'd encourage you to look at the SQL reference from FileMaker for details about all of those functions. Some of the popular string functions are like trim, left, right, upper. Those correspond exactly to what you think they would do in a similar FileMaker calculation. There's some number functions, some date functions, et cetera, to convert types and things like that. There are aggregate functions to allow you to, just like in FileMaker, sum, fields, average count, et cetera. There's some conditional or logical type functions that let you do case, or much like an if, to combine values together or pick a value that's not null using coalesce. There's some container field functions. These do not work with the execute SQL function inside of FileMaker, but if you're using ODBC or JDBC, these functions allow you to work with that binary data in your container fields. Error handling, troubleshooting SQL syntax errors. The easiest way to do that now is with the data viewer in FileMaker Pro 16, so check that out. Trapping errors in your scripts is really important. You can use getLastError to see if an error occurred after an import or an execute SQL script step. But the getLastExternal error detail function is going to give you more detailed information about the exact error that happened. If you've got an error in your SQL statement or something like that, you want to call that, get the value of that function immediately after your script step so that you can see what happened there. The ODBC logs are another great way to get information from there as well. So now, how are we doing on time? So I'm doing okay. So let me open up this other example file that I've got here. This file is out there on the website. When you download the materials for this session, you'll have this file. There are 98 examples that I've got included in there. I'm going to show you 9 of those real quick in here. I'll just give you a quick orientation to what this file is doing. Basically, you type a SQL statement up here. The results are going to show down here. This is just a calculation field that's using the execute SQL function to take this SQL statement, apply any parameters that are in here, and there's a couple of fields right in here in the middle where I can put in parameters that I want to use. Also over here, I've got a couple of kind of hidden fields that are used for the field separator, the row separator that get passed into that calculation. So this first example, we're just selecting everything from the context table in this file. So that's really simple. You can make a change to this calculation, though, to add a where clause, and do whatever you want there. As soon as you exit that field, this calculation at the bottom will update. So it's a great way to explore these SQL statements. The next example I've got here is using some parameters. So we're selecting all the fields from the context table where the ID value is in this list of values. In this case, instead of just hard coding those values, I'm passing those in as parameters, those 4th, 5th, 6th parameters to this function. And so the result I get is just the records for those parameters. Next example I've got here is using something different for the field separators. Notice I hard-coded using the in operator here, hard-coded those ID values. But the interesting thing in this example is concatenating some HTML tags around the values that we're getting from this record using some carriage returns between the records, so that essentially we're getting these table row tags, table data tags for our values so that we could feed this into an HTML calculation. So you can do HTML, XML, you could probably work this into some JSON, things like that if you wanted to do so. So there's a lot you can do with these field separators, row separators, beyond just using commas and returns. You can use tabs. You can use multiple characters and do some pretty interesting stuff. Next example here is just a little more complex where clause, where we're taking the lowercase value of the first name field and comparing that to the value m with a wildcard character. This percent stands for any characters, much like you'd use an asterisk in a FileMaker find. this works the same way. So SQL finds are case sensitive in almost all cases. So if we didn't use this lower function, then you're not going to get values that have an uppercase starting character. So that would not work. So if we change this, let's just change this to the letter G, and then we get all the names that start with the letter G. Here's another calculation using the distinct keyword. So we're looking at our contacts table, but we're returning just the cities and states for the records that have the state equal to Missouri. So this is a distinct list of the state or the cities that are in the state of Missouri. And you can do a lot with that as well. The distinct keyword kind of consolidates everything so that you're not getting duplicate records in your result set. This is a little more complex select statement with some subqueries and kind of a correlated subquery going on here. It's a little bit complex to get into in this setting, but basically start on the inside of this and look at what these pieces are doing and how they fill in together. So basically you're getting a city name, the count of that city name as it appears in our list of contacts, and then we're calculating a percentage of the total number of contacts that we have in the state of Florida by using the group by there. So dig into this calculation if you want to understand more about how that's working, but that's a calculation using a tab character as a separator. So you could use that to feed it right into create an Excel spreadsheet or use a virtual list to display this data. The result is just text that you're going to get back from this, but you've got lots of options for using other functions in FileMaker to display this in a nice, pretty way. This is just a very simple example, pulling a value from really a static value. There's nothing field related in what I'm selecting here. I'm just using a function to say, give me the left 4 characters of the word delicatessen from a kind of a dummy table that I've got out there that just has one record in it, and I called that table one record. So that lets me use the SQL function just as a test here to see what I get with that particular function. So you'll see other examples in this file that use that approach using that one record table to do some calculations. There are a couple of kind of hidden tables that exist in FileMaker. In every database, you could take this calculation as it is, use it in an execute SQL function in any database that you've got in FileMaker, and you'll get a result like this. So the tables that I'm talking about here are FileMaker underscore fields and FileMaker underscore tables. So these are kind of meta tables that you've got that you can query to get information about your tables and the fields inside of those tables. There's lots of information in there about the field types and things like that in that data. What I'm doing right here, though, is just taking the distinct base table names and counting the number of fields in each of those tables and displaying an ordered list of those. So the order by statement I'm using up here, rather than referring to a field name, because my second field here is essentially a select statement, a subquery, I'm saying I can use that second value in my sort descending based on that value so that I get the tables with the most fields appearing at the top of the list. All right, one more example in here, select star from contacts, and this is really just an example that returns an error. So anytime you have an error in your SQL statement outside of the data viewer, you're going to get the dreaded question mark. And you'll see this a lot. It'll be, if you're just getting started with writing SQL and using the execute SQL function, you'll run into that question mark a lot. And it basically means you've got a syntax error somewhere in your query. In this case, I've got that data type mismatch that we looked at earlier. If I take these quotes off of here and commit that record, then it works as you would expect it to. But anytime you see a question mark as a result, that means you've got a syntax error. You probably want to debug that query in the data viewer to make sure it's doing what you expect it to. You'll get a little more information by doing that. All right, so like I said, there's lots of examples in this file. Some of them are much more complex, some are simple, but it demonstrates a lot of the functions that you can use at the SQL level in these calculations. So everything is out there on the website right now, so you can go grab that, get the files, the Keynote file. There's some additional slides that I've skipped over today that are in that PDF out there. And that SQL example file is out there as well, so feel free to dig into that. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you attending my session. I'd love to take some questions. If anybody has some, please come to the microphone if you can. Thank you. Any questions? All right, I see a few people making their way to the microphone. Oh, it's a race. Go ahead.
Hey there. Thank you for the session.
Sure.
I had a question on execute SQL.
Mm-hmm.
When do you use execute SQL versus a perform find? And some of the examples of dashboards I've seen in other classes, they all tend to use execute SQL. Why is that?
Really because it's easy. It's not context sensitive, so you can have a dashboard layout that is based on any table and use execute SQL to get values from any table in your system without having to switch context like you would with a find. So that can be very convenient. You can do some aggregation and things with SQL statements that are more complex to do with finds, so you can pull values from multiple tables, join them together without creating new relationships on your graph. So that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, I've been trying to use this with tables that are in a different file. Does it work? Because I can't get it to work. Or do you set it up as an external data source in order for that to work? Or?
So yes, it should work. Basically, you should be able to reference any table occurrence that is on your graph. So you have to add table occurrences for those external tables to the relationship graph in the file that you're doing the calculation in.
Okay.
And then it should work. You always want to reference the table occurrence name, not your base table name. So if the table may be named one thing, but you're always using the table occurrence name within your SQL statements.
Okay, I'll try that.
Sure.
Hi. Sort of a twofold question. One is, my assumption is that the privilege set that they're logging into the SQL table is going to be whatever was set up, that's going to be inherited through FileMaker when they're going into the system.
Yes. So there's a couple of pieces to that, and I didn't dig into it too much, but if you're accessing FileMaker as an ODBC data source, you have to use an extended privilege called, I believe it's FMXDBC, that you assign to the privilege set that you want to have access to your data. Otherwise, they won't be able to connect. Even if they've got a FileMaker login, they won't be able to connect through ODBC. So you have to set that up explicitly. If you're talking about the execute SQL function and what they're doing with that, the privilege set settings for their privilege set is going to apply the same way as if they were in layout. So if they're restricted and not able to see a particular table, for instance, they won't be able to do a SQL query to get to that data either.
Okay. So if they shouldn't be deleting them, they can't.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. It will respect that.
Good. And then the second question was, I haven't been through your files yet, but is there right join, left join, or do you have to take each table individually?
Yes, there are, I believe, right join, left join, and inner join are options that you can use, and I think I have some examples in that SQL file of each of those.
Great. Thanks very much.
Sure.
I did kind of miss here and there with what you're talking about, but what I understand is I can use those different functions or SQL commands to go through several different tables, bring back the information I'm looking for, and then also import that into FileMaker?
Yes, you can. So if you're talking about connecting to an ODBC data source like MySQL or SQL Server, Oracle, things like that, you can use SQL statements to pull that data into FileMaker using imports, script steps, or you can do it manually through the file menu and just import into the current table. But you can script all of that if you want to and grab data from lots of different sources.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
How's it going? Our current solution, we have ODBC and we're importing it, so we're having to install FileMaker on all the different client computers.
Right.
But we're looking into WebDirect to deploy it, so it would be a website. Is the same restriction with the FileMaker Go, same with WebDirect?
So WebDirect will use, you can use the import record script step with WebDirect. You have to set up the DSN and the driver on the server.
On the server, okay.
And that will work. Now, you can also use that from Go if you use perform script on server.
And that's a script. I Googled that because I wasn't sure what that was.
Yeah, there's a
I'm
script
just the
step.
product manager, not the developer.
Yeah,
so-
there's a script step called perform script on server. It works
Okay.
just like perform script, but instead of performing the script locally, it asks the server to perform that script for
Okay.
you. And that way it can use the driver and DSN that's set up on the server, and you don't have to set it up on each workstation.
Okay, great, cool.
Yep.
I might be reaching out to you, thanks.
Sure.
So can you string together multiple where clauses? Like where you, in your example, it said where ID is in the
Yep.
hard code.
So you can use Boolean logic with and or and not, and you can use parentheses, and you can create some really complex where clauses, really using any combination of that logic.
So it's all embedded in, it's kind of nested in one where clause? And
Yeah,
just
you can
keep
put it
going
all
in?
into one where. You wouldn't use multiple where clauses. You would put it all into one where clause and use and or
Okay.
and parentheses and stuff to make that work.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. All right, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you attending.